you recording? Ready? All right. To begin our event tonight, we honor Assata Shakur, political prisoner. Assata presente. Let us join together with the chant that prefaced every Black Lives Matter demonstration in Baltimore. So repeat after me. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love each other and support each other.
We must love each other and support each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
On behalf of the Struggle for Socialism Party and the People's Power Assembly, I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's forum and discussion with Leonardo Flores, Venezuelan political analyst, activist, and founding member of the Venezuelan Solidarity Network. Tonight, we also turn our attention to the global Samud flotilla, carrying aid to the starving people of Gaza, which is currently under illegal attack by the Israeli occupation forces. Around 500 volunteers from more than 45 countries are part of the 44-vessel fleet, including European Union members of Parliament Rima Hassan and Emma Farrow, Nelson Mandela's grandson, Mandla Mandela, former mayor of Barcelona, Ada Chalot, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire star Adele Hanel and Greta Thunberg. The flotilla is carrying hundreds of tons of aid, including medicine, food, baby formula, diapers, and prosthetic limbs to Gaza, where Israel has continued to occupy and starve 2 million Palestinians. Protests are happening everywhere, including Baltimore, where our members have joined with the Palestinian youth movement to demand hands off the flotilla. Internationally, Italy's largest union has called a general strike Friday in support of Gaza aid. Our discussion is critical. The U.S. Pentagon is poised to go to war with Venezuela, a war that will be disastrous not only to the people of Venezuela, but to the youth and workers right here at home. We must stop it. Tonight's discussion will counter the lies and misinformation spread by the media. Before I call on Flores, I would like to call on Carrington from the PPA and Struggle for Socialism Party to announce some important upcoming activities.
Good evening, everybody. Sister Bros and siblings. So just kind of give you all a quick rundown what we're up to currently. This coming October 14th, we're going to be celebrating George Floyd Day. We know.
Come on here, Carrington.
Okay. I'm so comfy. But yeah, so this October 14th, we'll be celebrating George Floyd Day. We know U.S. government passed a bipartisan piece of legislation to honor, the racist Charlie Kirk. So we're flipping it. We're making it more of a people's holiday, George Floyd Day, because it's his birthday too. We also have a film showing honoring the African revolutionary Thomas Sankara. We'll be showing The Upright Man. Stay tuned for when that will be. And along with a field trip to the Harriet Tubman Museum out at Eastern Shore, we're also planning that. Stay tuned for that date as well. You can get on our email list. And you can get on our email list and follow us on social media to know when the date will be. And we also are currently fighting for a campaign to win a city-owned grocery store to end the food desert, specifically in West Baltimore, Sandtown, Upton, and Harlem Park area, in honor of Bilal Abdullah, the famous Baltimore A-rapper who was murdered by BPD in June. And then we're also part of a campaign, we are heading a campaign, to rename the Francis Scott Key Bridge to the Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge, and also honor the 6 workers that lost their lives that night. So that's kind of what we're up to, so you can stay tuned by plugging into our emails and social medias. And yeah, hope to see you all around.
All right, so without further ado, we will hear a presentation by Leonardo Flores, and after this presentation, we will have a discussion. So Leo, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Can you folks hear me in the back? Can folks hear me in the back okay? Yes, okay, great. So let me start off with what's going on, and it's that the U.S. has deployed a lot of folks and a lot of ships and even planes to the Caribbean just off the shores of Venezuela. There's the latest reports that there's roughly 6,500 troops, dozens of warships, and more planes landing every day in Puerto Rico, where they're conducting exercises for an amphibious invasion. It's a really, really dangerous situation. It's a wild escalation of previous U.S. policy towards Venezuela, but it's something that we've been kind of seeing coming over the last 2 decades, really, because of this attitude of U.S. imperialism that really needs to control and dominate not just Venezuela, but everywhere, everywhere from Caracas to Gaza to Baltimore itself, right? It's something we all live with every day. And so far, the U.S. has taken down at least 3 ships that off of Venezuelan waters, killing 17 people. I'll go into that in a little bit. But before I talk about what's happening and like why they're actually there, let me talk a little bit about the pretext for this apparent invasion or this deployment of the military. It's actually the biggest deployment in the Caribbean since at least 1989 when they overthrew Noriega in Panama. Yeah, so it's a dangerous situation, and they're all basing it on this wild theory that somehow Venezuela is responsible for quote unquote narco terrorism. This idea that Venezuela is somehow flooding the streets of the United States with drugs, and not just with drugs, but with immigrants who aren't really immigrants. They are terrorists in disguise here to cause havoc in our cities. But, you know, when you look into it a little bit, Venezuela has never engaged in any sort of terror attack, never been even linked to any sort of terror attack. So already half of this pretext is all kind of, you can flush it away because it makes no sense, right? This idea that somehow drug dealers are now terrorists. And when we look at the actual statistics, not just from the UN, but from the USDEA itself, we see that not only does Venezuela produce 0 coca leaf, which is the base ingredient for cocaine, it produces 0 cocaine. It produces no fentanyl or no chemicals that lead to the production of fentanyl. And that's important because Venezuela has never even been linked to fentanyl, but now because of what we're seeing in our cities is addiction to fentanyl and other opioids, right? Yeah. And that's what people really focus on when we talk about drugs lately. And now they're kind of switching the goalpost, saying, "Oh no, it's not Venezuela's cocaine, quote unquote. It's fentanyl." But there's never been any fentanyl coming from Venezuela, so that's a very naked excuse, right? And then, so back to these DEA and UN figures, according to both of these institutions, about 5%, only 5% of the global cocaine transits through Venezuela. So Venezuela is not a producing country, but it is a country that is next to the biggest producers of cocaine in the world, which happen to be Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, to a certain extent, Ecuador. And 87% of this cocaine that's produced on these Pacific Coast countries passes through the Pacific. Venezuela, we don't have a map here, but Venezuela doesn't have a Pacific coastline, right? So if the bulk of the cocaine is passing through the Pacific, actually 70%, and this is according to the Ecuadorian government itself, 70% of all the cocaine goes through Ecuador, which has a right-wing government right now, a president whose family owns a banana corporation where suspiciously cocaine is routinely found in some of these shipments. There was just several tons found in a shipment to Russia just a couple of weeks ago. This is a company that belongs to the president, the right-wing president of Ecuador. And obviously the other big player in cocaine, which I briefly mentioned, was Colombia, which is not just a major producer, but also a major transit country as well. And just curiously, we know that the US has 7 military bases in Colombia, right? So if this problem of international drug trafficking was one that could be solved by US militarism, which obviously it isn't, because we've had this problem for decades now, and the US has spent billions of dollars, not just in Plan Colombia, which was this plan to really hit the cartels in Colombia back in the 90s, 2000s, but also the same thing happened with Mexico. And these plans totally backfired, and cartels are stronger than ever in some of these countries. So if you were really concerned about stopping this trade of cocaine, you wouldn't focus on Venezuela, where only 5% of cocaine exits through. You'd focus on the Pacific. On top of this, you have this kind of rhetoric about the so-called Tren de Aragua, which I'm sure some of you all have heard of, and the Cartel de los Soles. And let me talk a little bit about both of those organizations. So the Tren de Aragua, Trump talked about it a lot on his campaign trail as a way to kind of denigrate migrants and really Latinos in general. And in the case of the Tren de Aragua, TDA for short, it's not even a cartel, but it is a criminal organization where they do kind of murder for hire and security for cartels, human trafficking. And the really interesting thing is that it surges roughly between 2015, 2017, when the US economic war against Venezuela was hitting its peak. And it surges in part because because of the threats faced by Venezuela, they had to kind of move resources away from fighting cartels and fighting, organized crime internally to securing the borders because of this threat of invasion. Not just invasion, but really because of the threat of covert operations and mercenaries sneaking into the country to cause terror attacks. And, mercenaries are caught there in Venezuela. Every year they catch dozens. And I mean mercenaries, not just from neighboring countries, but from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the United States. It runs the gamut. The thing is, Venezuela basically went to war against Tren de Aragua. They had massive major military operations, and the organization was functionally destroyed in Venezuela in early 2023. And since then, the leaders, some of them escaped. And now it's barely an organization, but criminals use the name because it has a certain cachet, right? Because even the US government is scared of the Tren de Aragua. So if you're a criminal and you say you're Tren de Aragua, that already immediately kind of, makes people pause. And so that's what we're seeing now is more and more criminal organizations adopting this name to kind of, to build on its rep or to gain from the reputation of a cartel, of an organization that barely exists. On top of this, we had the US government saying repeatedly that there's this really massive coordination between the Tren de Aragua and the Venezuelan government. And yet the US itself doesn't believe that. I'm going to read this quote from a National Intelligence Council memo from April. And this was leaked, and this memo says, and I'm going to read 3 quotes. The first one is, the Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with Tren de Aragua and is not directing Tren de Aragua movement to and operations in the United States. Venezuelan intelligence, military, and police services view Tren de Aragua as a security threat and operate against it in ways that make it highly unlikely that the two sides will cooperate in a strategic or consistent way. Venezuelan security forces have periodically engaged in armed confrontation with Tren de Aragua. So even the US intelligence services understand that Tren de Aragua is a threat, not just to the United States to a certain extent, but to Venezuela, and that Venezuela has been dealing with it. But then on the other side, you have these kind of basically led by Marco Rubio and the Cuban right-wing extremists within the US government, who are pushing this narrative that no, there's somehow a tie between the Maduro government and the Tren de Aragua, and that's, their pretext for wanting to undertake regime change in Venezuela. And not only that, but of course, we've seen how Venezuelan migrants and really Latin American migrants in general have been really, slandered with these allegations that they're all criminals, that they're somehow tied to transnational organization or the Tren de Aragua. And so far, roughly 8,000 people have been deported from the United States to Venezuela over this past year. Only one person was found to have a Tren de Aragua connection, and they were immediately arrested upon arriving to Venezuela. Only 2% of all those 8,000 people that were supposedly all criminals that ISIS has been going after, only 2% ever had a criminal record in Venezuela. And instead, the United States is not only deporting these people in horrible ways, sending to the, say, Alligator Alcatraz or the torture prison in El Salvador. Thankfully, the Venezuelans are gone from there, but there's still, I think the number of 3,000 to 5,000 people in El Salvador still left in this horrible torture prison. And you have families being separated, dozens of children, Venezuelan children here in the US in foster care while their parents are back in Venezuela with no real way to reunite them easily because there's no U.S. embassy, or excuse me, there's no Venezuelan embassy here in the United States anymore. Even the DEA in its National Drug Threat Assessment, this is a yearly report that DEA publishes. This is a quote itself, Tren de Aragua conducts small-scale drug trafficking activities. So they're pitched by the Trump administration as being this major cartel that's flooding the streets of the United States with either fentanyl or cocaine. And yet the DEA doesn't consider them a cartel. And it says that they're small-scale drug traffickers. So obviously this is just pure propaganda that we're supposed to swallow. And we're not even supposed to check on it because if you look at the DEA's own website, it says it right there very clearly that they don't consider them to be a cartel and that they're small-scale in action. When it comes to the Cartel de los Soles, translates to the Cartel of the Suns, this one's even more ridiculous because it's a totally fictional cartel. It doesn't exist at all. The first reference that you ever saw to something that even close was the Cartel of the so-called Sun. This was actually a CIA operation in 1993. And I recommend that you Google the CIA's cocaine. It's from 60 Minutes. It's a segment that they did back in 1993 where they detail how the CIA, with the help of this Venezuelan brigadier general in the National Guard, wanted to so-called infiltrate the Colombian cartels by smuggling cocaine from Colombia through Venezuela to the United States. Tons and tons of cocaine, generally millions of dollars for the CIA and for this general. It's called the CIA's cocaine. And so then jump forward 20 years, or in 2005, there's an article with an anonymous source in the Miami Herald saying, oh, the Venezuelan government harbors the cartel de los Soles. Whenever you see some sort of anonymous source in a publication, particularly like the Miami Herald, it's a CIA asset, just planting information into this mainstream media, right? And when I say it's fictional, it's not just me saying it, right? If you look at these, I mentioned the National Drug Threat Assessment. It's a yearly report, right, put out by the DEA. And I went back to all the ones that they've published since 2010. Most of them are available online. A couple of them are not publicly available. Do you know how many times it mentions the Cartel of the Suns? Can anyone guess? Zero. Every single report of these has sections and sections on the active cartels in the hemisphere, and there's zero mention ever of the Cartel of the Suns. I mean, in fact, in this year's report, there's 13 pages dedicated to different cartels. The Cartel of the Suns is not mentioned. So why are they actually deploying to Venezuela? Why have they killed fishermen? Why have they, scared not even killed fishermen? No, excuse me. They've killed migrants, basically. And they've scared fishermen. And now Trump is bragging about, the fact that there's no boats in the Caribbean. And that's somehow a good thing because, fisher people can't make a living anymore thanks to Trump's threats. And not only that, but it's wild to see the United States kind of bragging about killing innocent people in this way. Generally, if there's a drug boat, it gets seized, especially if you have dozens of ships in the water, right? So the first strike, it's curious to me that there's actually been pushback in Washington on this. And we can talk a bit more about why I think that might be. But let me read this quote from, this was from a New York Times article on this first strike of a boat that was supposedly carrying 11 drug traffickers. First of all, it's ridiculous because if you're going to traffic drugs, you're not going to put 11 people on a speedboat. It's going to be 3 people and then tons of cocaine, right? You're not going to move people along with your cocaine. This quote from the New York Times, but officials briefed on the strike said that the video does not tell the entire story. So there was this video showing this boat kind of blowing up, and it was like they caught very different angles of it and put together this very slick edited video. The video does not show the boat turning. It was turning around after the people aboard were apparently spooked by an aircraft above them, nor does it show the military making repeated strikes on the vessel even after disabling it. So not only were these people turning around, the U.S. shot at them multiple times. First of all, how many missiles do you need to take down a small speedboat? It doesn't really, paint a good picture in terms of how efficient the U.S. is being here. In the second boat, the boat wasn't even moving. It was just sitting in the water, and then you see this missile hit it, and it's destroyed, right? So 17 people already dead in what is a very clear violation of not only U.S. law, but international law, right? Due process is supposed to extend not just to citizens or people in the United States, but to actions that the United States undertakes abroad as well. But what we're seeing now is kind of the war on drugs meeting the war on terror, meaning that the Constitution goes out the window. It doesn't matter. As long as the president says that this person's a terrorist, he can therefore legally, this is according to not just Bush, but also Obama and Biden and Trump, he can somehow legally just order their death. And so when we look at this kind of deployment, is it enough for an invasion of Venezuela? Absolutely not, right? You're not going to invade a country that has 30 million people, a country that is both bigger than Iraq and bigger than Afghanistan, with 6,500 Marines. So what it's there for is really as a mode of psychological warfare, right? They're trying to provoke a reaction. And one of the main reactions they're trying to provoke is that they're trying to get generals within the Venezuelan military to defend. And we've seen this because they're very open about it on social media. There's this guy named Marshall Billingsley who was a big Trump, he was big in the Department of the Treasury during the first Trump administration. And then he got denied by the Senate to go to the State Department because Marshall Billingsley was one of those people who wrote memos saying that it was okay to torture people in Guantanamo. And for somehow the Senate blocked his nomination this time around. But he's been posting pictures of random Venezuelan generals, posting, kind of doxing them, really, like saying, like, this is their information, we're waiting for you in Miami. Like, he's basically encouraging people to defect, and none of it has happened, right? This massive deployment aimed solely at kind of breaking the will of the Venezuelan military has totally failed. So on top of that, now that this has failed, now the theory is that they're trying to provoke some sort of accident or false flag event whereby the Venezuelan military can be blamed if something happens to either a U.S. Marine or Navy person or a ship, right? And accidents happen, especially if you have all these massive deployments and you're conducting all these exercises. But what we also know it's really there for, it's to kind of provide help for covert actions, the terrorism, sabotage, assassinations. When we look at Venezuela, we've seen this sort of thing happen repeatedly over the past 10 years. I don't know if you all remember, but in 2018, there was I think it was in August 2018, there was a military parade in downtown Caracas. President Maduro was there with his cabinet, and then, the military was parading because of a holiday. And suddenly there was a massive explosion in the air. And it turned out there were 2 drones full of C4 that exploded. And they exploded prematurely because of intelligence, Venezuelan intelligence caught them in time. But this is kind of almost normal to hear about these sorts of plots that are going on against Venezuela, like mercenaries caught outside of major oil production facilities, and they're caught with guns and ammunition and all sorts of GPS equipment and explosives. And this happens several times a year in Venezuela. So what has been Venezuela's response to this deployment and to these threats by the United States? Well, the first response was that, there was a massive push to have people enlist in Venezuela's militias. So Venezuela, on top of having, the normal armed forces and a reserve, has popular militias where people who really want to defend their country can learn and be part of this militia. Right now, between all the armed forces and the reserves and the militias, there's 8 million people in Venezuela who are ready to fight for their country and fight for their land. The troops have been kind of deployed throughout the whole country. There's this state of readiness for an invasion. It may not come, but what might happen, and what the Trump administration has been threatening for the last month, is strikes within Venezuela. So if the worst case scenario in the short term that I see is that the Trump administration is going to start bombing and drone striking within Venezuela at any time. That's certainly a possibility. But the thing is, a lot of people in Washington specifically are saying, oh, this is going to lead to possibly a civil war in Venezuela. It really isn't. And I'm saying it's not, because the time for a civil war in Venezuela would have been 6 or 8 years ago, when the sanctions had totally destroyed the country. The U.S. economic warfare on Venezuela was so bad that the government lost 99% of its revenue. Right? So the revenue, GDP went down by almost 99%. And not only that, the country, was saved basically from famine through organizing, through grassroots organizing where food was delivered directly to the people who needed it most. And the interesting thing that's happening right now is that even people within the Venezuelan opposition are rejecting a U.S. intervention. And it's really shoring up Maduro's support. So I'm going to read a couple of polls. The first one is from an opposition-linked poll. In Venezuela, everything is very polarized. So you have polls linked to the opposition and polls that are somehow linked to the government. So this poll is an opposition-linked poll, and it found that only 3% of Venezuelans would support military action. A different poll found that 93% of Venezuelans reject these U.S. threats. So there's a consensus within Venezuela, which is not the consensus when you look at, say, Twitter, the Venezuelan Twitter, which is really, filled with bots and with paid influencers, or with these think tanks that are really pushing for war against Venezuela. But the consensus in Venezuela is against war. And interestingly, the consensus in the United States seems to be against war too. We saw this YouGov poll came out a couple of weeks ago showing 62% of people in the United States oppose the U.S. invasion. That's really big, given the massive amounts of propaganda that we've been subjected to for Venezuela for the past 25 years. It's pretty heartening to see that 62% are against the U.S. invasion. But I can talk a little bit too about what's driving this kind of push for regime change. Obviously, there's geopolitical reasons, Venezuela being one of the few socialist nations in Latin America, along with Cuba and Nicaragua. Obviously, Venezuela has, the highest reserves of oil in the world. Not just that, but Venezuela has rare earth minerals, has iron, has gold, it has water. It has a lot of these resources that the U.S. has been really wanting to control for some time now. But there's an interesting kind of split within the Trump administration, because on the one hand, you have these kind of neocons who really want war, and they're being led right now by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And we should remember that Rubio, back during the first Trump administration, when he was just a senator, even then he was totally directing Trump's Latin America policy. So he was the brains behind the so-called maximum pressure policy that really cracked down on Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua's economies, driving the very migrants here that they're now forcibly and horribly expelling, right? And on the other hand, you have the kind of the more MAGA isolationist types, led by this guy named Richard Grenell. I mean, I don't want to say anything nice about Grenell. The only thing nice to say about him is that he wants diplomacy with Venezuela, which would be, a breath of fresh air. Finally, I mentioned it a little bit, that it's interesting to see that there's actually politicians in Congress here saying, criticizing the Trump administration's maneuvers and criticizing these attacks. And that is, I don't know why that is, because generally it's, saying anything remotely even positive about Venezuela in Congress is toxic. I personally think it's because a lot of people in Congress are starting to feel guilty about Gaza. And then now they're looking for a way to kind of atone by stopping this war instead of stopping that genocide. But there is kind of a war powers resolution that would, in theory, limit Trump's abilities. But we need not just more of what's going on in Congress, but more really action by groups like People's Power Assembly and other grassroots folks who are actually doing the work on the ground in terms of political education. That's why I'm really thrilled to be here today, not just because you all are comrades and I love being with you, especially since, everything we went through back in 2019, a lot of craziness, which I'm sure you've heard from your comrades. But also because you guys are doing the work, and I really respect that, and I really kind of find you all inspiring. So thanks so much for the invite.
All right, let's start the discussion with questions. No, Sharon? Should I pass this around first? Okay. We're going to pass this around to collect for the Venezuela Solidarity Network. That's a great question. Is there?
Don't have a good way of accepting donations on.
We'll take them. We'll end up sending to you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I guess put in the note then. Yeah. All right. Well, that's passing around. Does anyone have questions? In the back.
How do the Venezuelan people see their government and the president?
Yeah, I mean, I think the country's polarized. The last elections kind of showed that. But one of the things to note is that while Maduro has he has the support of most voters, what we see is that even people who are not so involved in politics reject the fascist opposition even more. And really what the United States has been doing for the last 25 years is really pumping up this fascist opposition led by Juan Guaido back in the day. Now it's this woman named Maria Corina Machado. And they're basically like a fringe of the fringe party that's really just been elevated because of all the millions of dollars attached to the U.S. funds. And in terms of, what the people think of Maduro, I think the poll kind of shows it in terms of people, regardless of whether you like Maduro or not in Venezuela, people are totally against an invasion or the threats of an invasion, or what might come in terms of drone strikes or missile strikes or whatever. And so what we're seeing is kind of a sense of nationalism in Venezuela that's burgeoning once again after many years of political polarization and just kind of stagnation in a sense, because everything's been so hard because of the economic war against Venezuela.
More questions?
Yeah.
What about these Chinese vapes?
Chinese vapes?
What?
No.
Well, there's a lot of global propaganda right now against China, especially on social media. And one of the main things is that they are exporting cheap vapes to American teens. Poisoning them, I guess. I don't know if you've heard about that.
I hadn't heard about it, but it's interesting because a lot of this, so the Pentagon recently released this draft of their national defense strategy. And it's a big shift because before they were totally focused on China and East Asia, and now they're going to allegedly focus on the Western Hemisphere. And part of it is because they see Chinese activity in Latin America as a threat, right? And what are the Chinese doing in Latin America? They're just investing, really. That's the big difference between the United States and China, is that in terms of foreign policy, is that, China invests in all these countries. China's invested heavily in Venezuela. China gave big loans to Venezuela when the worst of the economic crisis was happening because of the sanctions. And because of that, and not right now, something like 80% of the oil that Venezuela produces is going to China versus 10% to the United States. And so separating China from Latin America is a big policy goal for the Pentagon and for the Department of State. So I'm not surprised to see any sort of anti-China propaganda, because that's kind of what they're going to actually be doing even more of in the future. Yes.
I'm Rick Kahn from Venezuela, America. We were wondering if you would say something about the solidarity with other Latin American countries besides the usual Nicaragua and Cuba, which of course that's
Solidarity. What do you mean solidarity in what way?
well, it just seems like that I've seen reports that there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Latin America with this attack on Venezuela.
Oh, I see. Solidarity from other Latin American countries towards Venezuela? Yeah, so that's really important, actually. I'm glad you brought it up, because right now, the most important position taken in Latin America, not from Cuba or Nicaragua, is from Colombia, where President Petro has taken a very strong line against U.S. intervention. In fact, Petro was the one saying that the Cartel de los Suns doesn't exist, that in fact, actual drug trafficking is controlled from mafias in the United States and in Europe. And that's actually true. Not only that, but the people who are making most of the money are U.S. banks like Wachovia, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, HSBC, among others. And Petro is really putting a lot on the line here, but also he kind of sees what the future holds, right? Because if they're droning ships or small boats off the coast of Venezuela, and their supposed goal is to stop drug trafficking, then the next country that's going to be droned or bombed is going to be Colombia. And after that, it's going to be Mexico. And there, President Sheinbaum has also been forcefully denouncing the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. So, and as has President Lula in Brazil. So there's really a consensus between, especially from the countries that are close to Venezuela, against any sort of military intervention. Obviously, given that we have right-wing governments in Peru and in Argentina, Dominican Republic, among other places, we have some countries that are kind of hedging their bets and saying, yeah, we'll support anything the U.S. does, but there's always been countries like that in Latin America that will do whatever the U.S. wants. Actually, Venezuela used to be one of those countries, and that's one of the big reasons that it's now a target, is that Venezuela is standing up to U.S. imperialism.
I guess I have a lot that I would like to learn about Venezuela and all its history, but to start, then could you summarize, I guess, like Venezuela's role in colonialization? For example, it was a big base of sugar plantation, or a big base of coffee, bananas. What kind of crops and what kind of...
Yeah, I mean, Venezuela was actually considered kind of a backwater colony back in the day, because they hadn't yet found the massive deposits of gold and other minerals that at the time of Spanish colonization were most important, like gold and silver that throughout Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia, other countries. So Venezuela was kind of perceived as this backwater colony, but Venezuela was really the country that helped set the stage for the liberation of other South American countries in particular, and Central American countries, from Spanish colonialism. Part of it, of course, was due in no small part, really, to the help that Bolívar received from Haiti, from the Haitian Revolution. So whenever we talk about Venezuela, as Venezuelans, we know that we have this historic debt with Haiti because they helped us become free. And then oil was found in Venezuela in the early 20th century, and that totally transformed the country. Went from there being a rural country to being one with two major cities, and most of the people left the countryside. The fields went kind of fallow. Venezuela became this country that used to import the vast majority of its food, and really became under the influence of the United States. There's a lot of words in Venezuela that have roots in English because of Texans that would come to Venezuela. So one of the things we say is "bana" a lot. Bana means like friend, and it comes from the word partner, like in a very kind of Texan accent, right? So that's where that, what like everyone's in Venezuela says "bana," and it's a U.S. based word initially. So after Venezuela found oil, it became a neo-colony, let's say, because it really was controlled by the oil interests of Chevron, of Exxon, of what was Texaco back in the day, and Mobil, all these corporations that now have slightly different names or configurations, until Chavez renationalized the oil industry, and then it became a target of attack, right?
Yeah, great segue, because I wanted to ask about where the state of the oil reserves, the state of the gold reserves, like, I know they don't have access to it, but how exactly?
So the gold reserves, I think you're talking about the gold that's being held in London.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not all the gold reserves, but there's about, I think it was something like $2 billion in gold, if I'm not mistaken, that the Bank of London basically froze. And they're just keeping, because the Bank of London can't decide who the president of Venezuela is. Like, it's up to them to decide, right?
Right.
So Venezuela has a lot of gold in the Bank of London, but, Venezuela also, when I was talking about gold earlier, I meant gold that still hasn't been extracted.
Yeah.
So Venezuela has been diversifying its where it stores its gold now because of the Bank of London. In terms of oil, Venezuela is up to something like 1 million barrels of oil a day producing, which back before the sanctions, it was about 3.5, 4 million. So the sanctions crippled the oil industry completely. And it's just moving its way back. And thankfully, things economically in Venezuela are better. It's not to say that they're good, but rock bottom has definitely been hit. The country's had something like 16 straight quarters of economic growth, with 4 straight years of economic growth, even though it's been modest. I don't want to say that things are great economically, because they're not. Hyperinflation is still a problem, and that's also linked to sanctions. But I think there's less of a sense of economic despair and just, a lack of hope. I think that's changed. But it's curious, because at the same, like a couple of weeks before the U.S. announced this deployment, the U.S. granted Chevron a license to operate in Venezuela. So, this is what I'm talking about when I say that there's contradictions within the Trump administration. On this one hand, there's the MAGA people want to negotiate, and they want that oil on, cheap terms. And on the other hand, you have ideologues like Marco Rubio, who wants to destroy Venezuela, in part because they think that destroying Venezuela will let them destroy Cuba. Right. And so I think that's one of the main aims of this kind of right-wing extremism that's, Cuban-American right-wing extremism that's kind of based in Miami, and it's really infiltrated the top levels of government in the U.S.
This may sound like a bit of a redundant question, but I'm really just curious if you know or happen to know. So, like, following the talks around like solidarity with other Latin American countries, and also Petro's recent call to action in terms of solidarity with Palestine, and specifically calling for a popular army, a solidarity army, the People's Army. If there's any number, a certain percentage of Venezuelan troops that are ready and committed to join that fight, or if they're more concerned about like nationalism protecting Venezuela, because obviously it's a very critical period.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for what the Venezuelan authorities are going to decide to do, but I'd be very surprised if they were able to commit troops, just because the threat is too big right now from the U.S. But certainly, Venezuela has had a very clear anti-Zionist position for a long time now. I think I was working at the embassy when back in, I want to say it was 2009, Venezuela, thanks to President Chavez, we broke off relations with Israel because of bombings in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And so Venezuela, Maduro's been one of the first people to compare Netanyahu to Hitler, to say that what's going on in Gaza is a genocide, to say that something has to be done. I think Petro, what he's doing in this kind of uniting for peace under the UN framework idea, I think it's fantastic, and I hope Venezuela supports him any way he can. I don't think that Venezuela would be in a position to send troops, but who knows? Hopefully someone is going to do something, because it's obviously it's awful what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank right now.
I just wanted to speak to that question very briefly, because we had joined the Protect Palestine grouping, international grouping. And actually, people should know that the Protect Palestine grouping has been purposely not calling on Venezuela or Cuba to actually send troops, basically be knowledgeable that their situation is different from the rest of the world. It's been South Africa and Colombia who've taken the lead on that. Venezuela and Cuba are part of the countries that have passed resolutions, pro-Palestinian resolutions in the Hague countries that were formed around this issue. So it's a question. It's a big question, and there's a lot of nuances involved in it. And so I don't want to go and derail our own conversation on Venezuela. But I want to say there was within the UN, and in the last time some of us went up to New York during that period from Thursday, we were at a meeting where the ambassador from Venezuela spoke, and then Friday, of course, Petro spoke, and then, of course, on Saturday, the Cuban ambassador spoke. And the common theme of everybody consistently was really against any intervention, any invasion, hands off Venezuela. People are united on that very much. And we're really at a critical period in that. But I just wanted to put that out a little bit in terms of information.
Question in the back.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if Venezuela is part of BRICS or trying to become a member of BRICS, and also if there's been any pushback from China, if they have a lot of investments in Venezuela.
Yeah, so Venezuela, it's not a member of BRICS, but I think there's various degrees of membership, and so Venezuela is certainly aligned with BRICS, and Venezuela's been pushing this idea of BRICS even before BRICS began. This idea of multilateralism and multipolar world, basically. Unfortunately, Venezuela is not in BRICS currently because Brazil, of all people,
Right.
of all countries, blocked Venezuela's entry. Basically under pressure from the United States following the elections last year in Venezuela. It was really short-sighted of Brazil to do that, especially because, I think President Lula thought that somehow throwing Venezuela under the bus would protect him and protect Brazil from U.S. imperialism. And yet Brazil has been hit with tariffs, but they've been threatened because of what they're doing to Bolsonaro, what they're rightly doing to Bolsonaro, who's been, sent to at least sentenced. I don't know if he's actually gone to jail yet. Maybe he's still appealing. But there's, clearly that strategy failed for Brazil. But Venezuela has very close ties with basically all of the BRICS countries. And so, at some point in the future, I'm sure Venezuela will join. The second part of the question was what? Sorry, I forgot.
But China could have
China.
been pushed back.
Yeah, I mean, they've pushed back rhetorically. They've said that they're totally against this deployment. They say it's a violation of international law. If push comes to shove and if there's some point in an invasion within the next couple of years of Venezuela, I don't know that China would intervene necessarily militarily. Certainly, they would send help. Certainly, one of the very first sanctions that Venezuela received was in 2005, 2006, and that was a total prohibition on arms sales from the United States and from any countries that use U.S. components. And that basically meant that Venezuela, prior to this, who used to be a client state of the United States, and all of their their weapons and their planes and their weapon systems came from the U.S. and came from NATO countries, that Venezuela had to shift completely to non-NATO sources. So now Venezuela has a lot of Russian and Iranian and Chinese weapon systems. So I would assume that in case any sort of military conflict, the Chinese would send weapons, presumably. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I don't know, but I would think so. Certainly, they, if the right wing, the fascist right wing, were to take power in Venezuela, they would absolutely, expel all Chinese business interests. They've made that very clear. Not just China, but Iran and Russia too, and they would basically put Venezuela's oil and other resources at the service of U.S. corporations.
Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to open the door because I wasn't able to be in that struggle in 2019. The comrades in the room, if you wanted to say something, Leo, just something, the story is a glorious battle.
Yeah, I mean, it was. Oh, but cool. I mean, it was glorious kind of after the fact because we, there was a delegation of people who defended the embassy who got to go to Venezuela later that summer. And what blew my mind was that people were recognizing them on the streets from the telesur coverage and stopping them and saying thank you, and like with like tears in their eyes. Because honestly, like Venezuelans felt really isolated and alone in January when the Juan Guaido steps like into a public plaza surrounded by the U.S. flag, the Israeli flag, and the Venezuelan flag to say that declare himself president kind of unilaterally. And you had 50 some countries, including some of the biggest players in geopolitics, say, "Oh yeah, this dude's the president." Actually, not the guy who won the elections, but this dude who just like proclaimed himself. And that kind of act of solidarity from people in the belly of the beast, from people, and knowing that folks came from Baltimore every day, literally, it really touched Venezuelans. And I'm among them, you know, like I love you all because you were there all the time. And you were there suffering the insults of the Venezuelan fascists, and they're not just their insults, but their spit in our faces, their punches, their kicks, like everything, right? And not only that, but we saw very clearly kind of like imperialism encapsulated into this like 1 block radius of the embassy, because it was the Venezuelan fascists working in conjunction with the Secret Service and the NPD, the Metropolitan Homeland Security, MPD, all these different police agencies, some of them federal and local police, to harass the people that were defending a sovereign territory.
Right.
And so the fact that you all were there, like, really touches me and all Venezuelans, because we know that, you know, how committed folks were to helping us in these like really awful times. And it was just really, you know, you three must have great stories, but like, it was bizarre to be surrounded literally by, I don't know, hundreds of Nazis who were just screaming at you for like 10 hours a day. Yeah. And like, knowing also that if you reacted at all, you would immediately be arrested.
And Stephen was.
Yeah. And so, like, and so that was like, you know, at the time, I think that was one of the coolest actions, and it still is one of the coolest actions I've ever been a part of in terms of a solidarity action, and you know, we need more of that, and we've seen kind of that in relation to Gaza, and honestly, like, it as a Venezuelan, it's hard to say, oh, agitate for Venezuela, given what's going on in Gaza, and I think one of the important things to know is that how linked all of these struggles are. Not just Gaza and Venezuela, but immigration and racism and white supremacy, right? And patriarchy. How linked all of these fights are, and how the only way that we're going to win is together. And when I say together, it's not just folks in Baltimore or folks in DC, it's folks everywhere. Have rising up at the same time and saying enough of this madness of these fucking psychopaths who are leading this world to a path of destruction.
More questions or?
Just with that, just so people know, if and when or how, when the US does do any action against Venezuela, we want to have an emergency response immediately and be out in the streets. And I think more than, that's what we are in control of, is what we do. So that's what we actually want to do for sure. And Leo was inside, what was your position inside of the embassy?
At that time, I was a political advisor.
Yeah, I know you were inside because we used to host meetings.
Yeah.
And just what people were talking about is that basically the embassy, they closed it down. They tried to close it down, and we were occupying it to keep the right wing from taking it over. So at times.
Georgetown.
Yeah, in the middle.
It was positively.
It was, and how long did we hold it?
We held it about a month and a half.
Yeah. They were turning the water off to, there were people inside and there were people outside. And they were, I know
And the Four Seasons Hotel is about a block and a half away, and they used to have a buffet for all the cops there.
And then they turned the water off, and they turned the electricity off.
Yeah.
And then we thought we were getting someplace, and finally there was nothing else. And so I don't want to digress. I think we ended real.
That thing you referenced, that thing you referenced about why I didn't make that announcement. I remember watching that inside the embassy and being like, this is pretty wild. Anyway, yeah, I think that's a great way to end it with it. So.
Awesome. Another round of applause.
Yeah. Oh.